Before the story begins, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. What time do you usually watch videos? And don't forget to suggest the next story or content you'd like to see. Story 1. The family portrait that smiled in the dark. The portrait had hung in the Richards family's hallway for nearly 60 years, a stiff black and white photograph of a family frozen in time. The grandfather, stern in a dark suit, sat in a carved wooden chair. His wife stood beside him with a pressed dress, one hand resting on his shoulder. Behind them, their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, stood like wooden cutouts, their faces unsmiling, eyes gazing forward, fixed on the lens of the long-dead photographer. Everyone who visited the Richards house remembered the portrait. It wasn't ugly or grotesque, but it had a certain way of making guests pause. The expressions were too flat, the eyes too sharp. Still, it was a piece of family history, and so it remained, hanging above the hallway console table, surviving renovations, relocations, and even a fire that scorched the walls decades earlier. For Claire Richards, the youngest living member of the family, the portrait was simply part of her life. She had walked past it since childhood, climbing the stairs at night while its glassy eyes watched her in silence. She thought nothing of it, until she was 15, when she first noticed the smile. It was late one evening, nearly midnight, and Claire had come down for a glass of water. The house was silent except for the creaks of the old beams. Passing the hallway, she glanced at the portrait out of habit. That was when she froze. The youngest boy in the photograph, who had always held a neutral expression, seemed to be smiling. His lips were faintly curled, and the shift was subtle enough that Claire thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. She shook her head, hurried into the kitchen, and told herself it was nothing. But the next night, it happened again. Only this time, it wasn't just the boy. The girl, the mother, even the grandfather. Each had the faintest tug at the corners of their lips, as if some hidden amusement had been discovered. Claire stood in the hallway for nearly a full minute, staring. The smiles weren't wide or exaggerated, but they were undeniably there. And worse, she could swear their eyes followed her as she backed away. By morning, the expressions had returned to normal. She tried to show her parents, dragging her mother into the hallway, but of course the photograph appeared unchanged. Her mother dismissed it as imagination. Still, the smiles returned every night. It became a ritual of dread. At first, Claire avoided the hallway after dark. She would rush up the stairs without looking, clutching the banister and counting the steps to keep her eyes away from the portrait. But avoidance didn't erase the knowledge. Each night she could feel them smiling in the shadows, the faces pressing closer to some secret truth. One evening, she dared herself to stand in the hallway longer, gripping a flashlight tightly in her hand. She shone the light on the photograph and gasped. The beam revealed more than just smiles. The children's heads seemed slightly tilted now, as though acknowledging her. The father's hand, once resting neatly on his thigh, appeared shifted, as if he had begun to rise from the chair. Claire dropped the flashlight, and the beam rolled wildly across the floor. When she picked it up and looked again, the portrait was as it had always been, lifeless and still. That night, she dreamed vividly. In her dream, she stood in the hallway again, but the house was silent in a way that pressed against her chest, as though sound itself had been stolen. She looked at the portrait, and the family smiled, this time broadly, teeth bared. One by one, they stepped out of the frame, climbing down from the photograph like people stepping off a stage. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The family circled her, their shadows tall and strange, whispering words she couldn't understand. When she woke, her throat was sore as if she had been screaming. Weeks passed, and Claire kept her secret. She stopped mentioning it to her parents, afraid of sounding insane. Yet the portrait grew bolder. Some nights the smiles would vanish only when she blinked, as though taunting her. Other times she would return from school to find the frame slightly crooked, the dust disturbed beneath it, though no one admitted to touching it. Her breaking point came one stormy night. The power flickered and went out, leaving the house drenched in silence and candlelight. As Claire made her way to her room, she couldn't help but glance at the hallway. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the portrait, and her blood ran cold. They were all smiling, every last one of them, their grins wide and gleaming, their eyes locked directly onto hers. But this time, their faces were no longer confined within the edges of the photograph. Cheeks pressed against the glass as though they were leaning forward, trying to break free. A thin crack split across the frame, spidering outward from the grandfather's eye. She screamed, waking her parents, who rushed to her side. But when they looked, the portrait was unchanged, unbroken, the family as neutral as ever. They soothed her, blamed the storm and her imagination, and guided her upstairs. Yet Claire knew what she had seen. The final incident came weeks later, during a sleepover. Claire had invited her best friend, Megan, hoping company might make her braver. At midnight, Megan wandered into the hallway for a glass of water. Moments later, Claire heard a crash. She bolted from her room to find Megan on the floor, the glass shattered beside her, her face pale with shock. "They smiled," Megan whispered, trembling. "Claire, the picture? They were smiling." At last, someone else had seen it. But Megan refused to speak of it again. She left the next morning and avoided Claire's house from that day on. The portrait remains in the hallway, untouched, the smiles hidden in daylight, but waiting in the dark. Claire is older now, nearly 20, but she still dreads the nights when thunder rattles the windows and the house grows quiet. Sometimes she swears she hears faint laughter from the hallway, as though the family in the frame is finally amused by her fear. And sometimes, in the deep silence after midnight, when the world outside is hushed and the house itself seems to hold its breath, Claire cannot help but believe that one day the smiles will no longer be contained by glass. That the family in the portrait will finish what they started in her dream and step fully into the world that has been waiting for them all along. Story 2, the wedding photo that erased the groom. It was the kind of photo you'd expect to see framed in someone's living room, a frozen moment of joy, captured in the sharp flash of a camera bulb. The bride in white, smiling with tears still clinging to her lashes, clutching a bouquet of roses. The groom in black, standing beside her, his hand on her waist, his posture a mixture of pride and nervous happiness. Guests blurred behind them, glasses raised, confetti in the air. A perfect picture of a perfect day, or at least that's what it had been when it was first taken. When Emily Simmons pulled the photo album from her parents' shelf years later, she was expecting nostalgia, not horror. She was 19, home from college, leafing through the dusty plastic sleeves of her mother's wedding pictures. She smiled at the familiar scenes, her grandparents laughing, the bridesmaids adjusting their dresses, her mother, radiant at 24, full of life. But then her eyes locked onto the photo. The bride, her mother Susan, was still there, bouquet in hand, face shining with youth. The confetti still hung in the air. The guests were still a blur. But where the groom should have been, there was nothing. Not a smudge, not a shadow, not even an empty silhouette. The space beside Susan was blank, as though the image had been cut out and patched over with something smooth and artificial. The hand that had once held her waist was gone, yet her posture leaned unnaturally, as if she were still bracing against the pressure of someone who wasn't there. Emily froze. She remembered the man who had stood there. Daniel Simmons, her father. He was alive, at least he had been until 4 years ago when he died in a car crash. His memory was still painfully vivid. His laughter, his cooking, his habit of humming tunelessly while reading the newspaper. He had been real, and he had been in that photo. Emily had seen it before, dozens of times. She had remembered his grin, the way his bow tie sat slightly crooked. But now the picture was altered, as if reality itself had bent to erase him. At first, Emily told herself it was a misprint, a damaged photo. She flipped forward through the album. There were dozens more pictures from that day. Susan cutting the cake, Daniel feeding her a bite. The couple dancing, Daniel's arm around her waist, her head tipped back in laughter. She turned back to the original photo again, but her stomach clenched. Daniel was missing there too. It wasn't just one picture. Every photograph of him at the wedding had been wiped clean. Susan stood alone in her white dress, surrounded by blurred guests, her hand often raised in mid-gesture to someone who wasn't there. The emptiness had an uncanny, deliberate precision. He wasn't faded or scratched away. He was erased, surgically, perfectly. Emily's breath quickened. She called for her mother. Susan entered the living room, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression warm but tired. Emily thrust the album toward her. "Mom, what happened to these?" Susan glanced down at the photo, then paled. The towel slipped from her hand. She sat down heavily on the couch and stared at the page as if she were looking into a grave. "It's happening again," she whispered. Emily's heart skipped. "What do you mean, again?" Susan didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose and went to the hallway closet. From the top shelf, she pulled down a shoebox wrapped in yellowed newspaper. Inside were more photographs, holidays, birthdays, snapshots of a life once shared. Susan spread them across the table with trembling hands. Emily looked down. They were all wrong. In a Christmas photo, Susan and Daniel had stood in front of a tree with little Emily sitting between them. Now Susan was crouching alone, her hand hovering above empty air where her husband should have been. In a picture from Emily's 5th birthday, Daniel had been helping her blow out candles. Now, only Susan and Emily leaned toward the cake, both of them angled awkwardly toward a space that should not have been empty. Every single photograph told the same story. Daniel Simmons had never been there. Emily shook her head violently. "No, this isn't possible. I remember him. You remember him. We all do." Susan's face was ashen. "I thought I was losing my mind when it started," she said. About a year after he died. The photos, they began to change. Slowly at first. 1 or 2 here, then more. At first, I thought it was grief playing tricks on me. But then your grandmother noticed too. She said our family albums were forgetting him, like the world itself was trying to erase Daniel. Emily clutched one photo with both hands, her knuckles white. But why? Why would this happen? Her mother's eyes glistened. "I don't know, but your father, he wasn't like other men. He used to say things, strange things, that didn't make sense until later. He'd wake up at night muttering about being followed, about something watching him. Once, when you were little, I found him tearing a Polaroid in half, saying, 'It can't keep me if I don't let it see me.'" Emily's stomach twisted. Her father had always been a little paranoid, but she had chalked it up to stress, to long hours at work. Now it felt like a thread connecting to something she didn't want to pull. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept the wedding photo on her nightstand, staring at the blank space where her father should have been. Around 2 a.m., she swore she heard something, a faint rustle, like paper shifting, like photographs turning themselves in the dark. When she sat up, the album was open on her desk. She hadn't left it that way. Heart hammering, she crossed the room. A new photo was on top, one she didn't remember seeing before. It was her father, standing alone in the driveway, smiling at the camera. Except his face. His face was blurred, stretched, as though something had tried to smear it out of existence. Emily screamed. Her mother rushed in, saw the photo, and pulled Emily into her arms. "It's getting worse," Susan whispered, "and I don't think it's going to stop." Emily never looked at the album again after that night. She couldn't bear it. The photos weren't just memories anymore. They were proof of something unnatural, something deliberate. The world had decided to erase Daniel Simmons, and the evidence of his existence was being stripped away piece by piece. And yet, Emily knew what terrified her most. Photographs weren't the only places where memories lived. What would happen when it wasn't just the pictures that forgot him? What would happen when she did? Story 3. The Polaroid wall that rewrote itself by morning. When Alice moved into her first apartment after college, she wanted something that felt like her own sanctuary. The place was small, just a studio above an old bakery, but she loved the smell of fresh bread drifting up every morning and the soft hum of city life outside her window. She had a ritual. Every week, she snapped a Polaroid of something she wanted to remember. Sometimes it was a meal she cooked, like sometimes it was a night out with friends, sometimes just the way the sunlight fell across her bed. Over time, the wall above her desk became a growing collage of these moments, her memory wall. It was comforting, a timeline of her life she could touch. But after one particular night, it became something else. One Friday, Alice went out with her best friend, Clara. They took silly pictures at a bar, including one Polaroid where Clara pretended to make a spooky face in the corner of the frame, her hands clawed, her smile wide. They laughed about it, pinned it on the wall, and forgot about it. The next morning, Alice noticed something strange. Clara's silly expression had changed. Her wide smile was no longer playful. It was unsettling. Her teeth looked sharper, her eyes wider, as though the photo had captured something Alice hadn't seen in the moment. Alice assumed maybe the film had developed strangely overnight. Still, it unsettled her enough that she slipped the photo off the wall and tucked it in a drawer. But the next morning, she found the photo back on the wall. Alice frowned, certain she hadn't put it there. She took it down again, this time sliding it into a book on her shelf. Yet the following morning, there it was again, back among the others, only now Clara's face was leaning even closer to the lens, her smile so wide it almost split her face. Alice called Clara to joke about it, but her voice cracked as she asked, "Do you remember making that face in the picture?" Clara paused. "What picture?" Alice explained, but Clara didn't recall ever posing that way. In fact, she insisted she hadn't even looked into the camera for that shot. That night, Alice taped the Polaroid face down to the wall, determined not to see it. When she woke, it had flipped itself upright. The image had changed again. Clara's figure was no longer in the corner. Instead, it was directly in the center of the frame, standing closer than anyone should have been when Alice snapped it. From then on, other Polaroids began to change too. The picture of her desk, once neat, now showed her books scattered on the floor, the chair overturned. The photo of her bed, once lit by warm afternoon light, now appeared in total darkness, with what looked like the faint silhouette of a person sitting at the edge. Every morning, the wall seemed to rewrite itself, each image bending into something darker, something more wrong. And always, Clara's distorted face appeared somewhere, sometimes pressed against a window, sometimes blurred in the background, sometimes standing right behind Alice. Alice grew frantic. She tore the wall down, stuffing every Polaroid into a shoebox, sealing it with duct tape, and hiding it in the back of her closet. That night, she barely slept, but when she woke, the wall was full again. Every picture pinned exactly as before, only this time the shoebox sat open on her desk. That morning, she couldn't call Clara. She had already received the news. Clara had died in a car accident the night before. Alice froze. The Polaroid of Clara, the very first one that had shifted, was now completely black. Every other photo on the wall showed Alice's apartment just as it was in reality, except in each one, a shadowy figure stood beside her, faceless, watching. Alice moved out within the week. She left the photos behind, telling the landlord she couldn't stay. But months later, long after she'd started over in a new city, she received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid, her new apartment, and in the corner, Clara's warped smile. Photographs are meant to preserve our memories, freezing time so we can look back and feel safe in what was real. But when those same images shift, distort, or rewrite themselves, it forces us to confront a terrifying question. If a photograph can change, then maybe our memories, our reality, aren't as secure as we believe. Tonight's stories remind us that sometimes the past doesn't just linger, it finds a way to return, altered and watching.